Welcome to the Natural History Museum. This building is full of natural wonders. Since its opening in 1881, the museum's collections have grown to around 80 million specimens. Each of them enables us to understand the natural world, the way it began, how it developed, and what its future may be. Over 300 scientists and other specialists work here, studying the specimens, to unravel some of nature's greatest mysteries and to help us deal with the problems that the natural world is now facing. This audio commentary guides you through the heart of the museum, Hinckley Hall. The exhibits here will show you how wide-ranging the museum's collections are and may encourage you to inquire further into what we know about them and the part they play in the way the world works. Along the way, experts from the museum's staff will talk about the histories and behind-the-scenes stories of the displays. So you can use this commentary to choose your own path around the hall and discover more about the particular objects and topics that interest you most. The American mastodon was one of the largest land mammals living in the Ice Age and was still roaming North America as recently as 13,000 years ago. They lived in pine forests and boggy areas covered by larch and spruce, feeding on twigs, leaves and water plants. You can see from the skeleton that their stubby toe bones were widely splayed. That gave them very broad feet, so that they were able to walk on the soft waterlogged ground beside ponds and lakes. Museum research leader Professor Adrian Lister is investigating the reasons why they disappeared.
The cause of the mastodon's extinction has been debated for a very long time. We know that around 13,000 years ago global climate cooled, and in the area where the mastodons were living in the US, they would have found a reduction in the abundance of the trees and water plants that they ate. But we also know that that's the point at which modern people first spread into North America, and we know that they occasionally hunted these large animals. So probably it was a combination of natural climate change, reduction in their food supply, and maybe the hunting by people just tipping them over the edge that did for the mastodons in the end. This story really has a lot of resonance for us today because the closest living relatives of the mastodons are, of course, our elephants. And if you think about it, the pressures that they are faced with are exactly the same. Their habitats are being reduced by cutting down of forests and so on. They are being hunted, and of course climate change is also drying up the habitats in many parts of the world. So we can see from what happened in the past that when species are faced by this combination of factors, they can be driven extinct. So that is really a lesson from the past to us at the present day.
The giraffe is the tallest of all living animals. It can reach up to nearly 6 meters above the ground, and it can do so because its legs and its neck are greatly elongated compared to the rest of its body. By studying specimens like these, one with its skin and the other without, so revealing its skeleton, scientists can work out the processes that led to the giraffe developing in this way, and also decide what characteristics distinguish one species of giraffe from another. But why should giraffes have become so tall? The answer may not be as straightforward as you might think. Museum scientist Dr. Natalie Cooper explains why.
Having a long neck can have some major disadvantages. One problem is drinking. Giraffes have to bend down quite low in order to reach water. This could be very difficult and also very dangerous because predators could very easily attack the giraffes while they're bending over. Another problem with having a long neck is that you need to be able to pump blood up to your head. The way the giraffe deals with this is by having a massive heart with really thickened muscles which allow it to pump blood all around its body. If being tall is so difficult, why do giraffes have long necks at all? Well, for hundreds of years, scientists believed that this was because giraffes were feeding on the highest branches, and this avoided them having to compete with other animals which were feeding in lower levels of the shrubs. However, more recently, scientists have changed their ideas. Some scientists believe it may be due to males fighting with each other, for which they use their long necks. Others suggest it may be used by the giraffes to look for predators on the horizon. And still more suggest it may be due to thermoregulation, so keeping the giraffe's body temperature constant in the hot savanna sun. It may be that the giraffe's long neck didn't evolve for a particular purpose at all. Perhaps it was just due to chance. The changing ideas about why giraffes have such long necks is a great example of science in action.
Natural science is all about discovery, rediscovery, and changing our opinions when new evidence is found. To see if you can make your own observations by comparing and contrasting different animals, head for the mammal galleries. Dinosaurs dominated the Earth for around 150 million years and evolved into a wide variety of shapes and sizes. This is the skeleton of one of the most historically important. It was originally called Iguanodon, but it's now been renamed Mantellisaurus in honor of Gideon Mantell, the English doctor who found the first evidence of this group in the Wealden sandstones of southern England in 1822. Museum research leader Professor Paul Barrett is one of a team of scientists at the museum who are studying the origin and lifestyles of these ancient reptiles.
The discovery of dinosaurs sparked awareness that species that were currently on Earth are different from those that lived in the past, and that some of those animals may have gone extinct. A philosophical breakthrough that allowed us to view life on Earth in quite a different way. Mantellisaurus and some of its very close relatives have a unique chewing mechanism that's not seen in any animal alive today. Living plant eaters, like cows and sheep, chew their food very thoroughly by swinging their lower jaw from side to side. In contrast, Mantellisaurus had a mobile upper jaw, which was able to rotate out slightly as the animal closed its jaws and moved its teeth together. This gave it a very powerful grinding motion that allowed it to chew tough plants. Scientists have debated how Mantellisaurus may have walked ever since the first skeletons were discovered. When we look at the proportions of the skeleton, we can see that the hind limbs are very strong and very long, and these features suggest that maybe it could have walked on its hind legs only. But when we look at the forelegs, we see that the toes are covered in hooves, which suggests that they may have been capable of supporting weight. Scientists currently think that maybe Mantellisaurus did both things, walking on all fours when it was moving slowly and feeding, and maybe taking to its hind legs when it needs to move more quickly and escape from predators.
The blue marlin is famous as one of the largest and fastest swimming of all fishes, the greatest prize for a sporting fisherman. In life, this fish would have been bright blue on its upper surface and paler below. A marlin feeds on smaller fishes and hunts for them by cruising in the surface waters. And there, its pale underside makes it difficult for fish below to spot it. This specimen was found in 2016 on a beach in South Wales. It was the first complete blue marlin to be washed up on British shores. It was a surprising discovery because blue marlin are so-called blue water fish, spending most of their lives in warmer waters far out to sea. Oliver Crimmen, the museum's senior curator of fish, describes some of the special adaptations of these agile marine predators.
This impressive 4-metre marlin started life as a small larva just a few millimetres long. It's an open ocean fish built for speed. That large spike on the upper jaw, the rostrum, is used in feeding, either in slashing or stabbing motions. They use this to capture smaller fishes, but occasionally they spear each other, cetaceans, whales and dolphins, even oil pipelines in the sea. It's clearly a defensive and an offensive weapon. Most fishes have body temperatures the same as the water that surrounds them. Marlin and a few other oceanic fishes are able to maintain a slightly higher body temperature using special muscles. In the case of the marlin, eye muscles generate heat that allow the brain and eyes to work more efficiently at low temperatures in open water. This is very useful for a predator that uses vision in locating prey. The movements of blue marlin in the ocean are clearly related to temperature, and warm water currents are an important factor in their distribution. Finding this specimen in the UK is important in the context of signals of climate change. Having this whole preserved specimen and a confirmed accurate record is very valuable for the museum scientists.
To see more marine marvels and bottled beasts, visit the Spirit Collection on the ground floor of the Darwin Centre. Trees and forests have had a huge influence on the evolution of life on our planet. Together, they span hundreds of millions of years of the Earth's history, from the 385-million-year-old tree at the front of this case, to the comparatively younger specimen at the rear, which is between 23 and 65 million years old. By examining specimens like these, scientists at the museum are able to explore ancient climates and ecosystems and then make predictions about the future of our planet. One of the museum's scientists tells us more.
I'm Dr. Paul Kenrick and I'm a research scientist at the Natural History Museum. The 4 fossil trees are of 2 distinct types. The 2 at the back resemble modern conifers, whereas the 2 at the front are really nothing like anything we see today. The second tree that you see grew in a swamp forest under very warm and humid conditions. These conditions are really important for the formation of coal, and much of the coal that we use today came from fossil forests like these. The 2 trees at the back are woody trees, and if you look at the one right at the back, you'll see that it actually looks like modern wood. In fact, it isn't. The wood has been replaced by minerals. Those minerals preserve the internal structure of the tree. Often you can see growth rings inside the wood, and that is an indicator of climate. Tree rings tell you the age of the tree, but they form when growth stops during a certain time of the year. In the UK, this is during the winter period. So when you see growth rings in the wood, that tells you that you have an environment in which there are seasons. These are just a few of the fossil plants in a collection of thousands that tells us about the history of life on Earth.
Coral reefs are one of the most biologically diverse ecosystems on the planet. They provide homes for over a quarter of all marine species. This giant coral was once part of a large reef off the coast of Western Australia. It was collected over 100 years ago, and at the time was the largest coral specimen held by any museum in Europe. Today, the museum has many thousands of specimens of corals. They help scientists to understand the changes that are now taking place in the ocean and to predict what will happen if those changes continue. Miranda Lowe, the museum's curator of higher invertebrates, tells us more about this particular historic specimen.
The coral you can see here is a turbinarian form of coral. It has many folds, and if you look more closely you can see thousands of tiny holes creating a pitted surface. And within those holes is the skeletal structure called a corallite. When the coral was alive, that corallite would contain a fleshy organism known as a polyp. Polyps have many tentacles which have stinging cells to actually paralyse small fish or prey to help feed the coral. If you look more closely at the surface of this coral, you can see encrusting bivalve shells and tube worms. Those animals actually live within the folds of the coral whilst obtaining food from the world's oceans. This specimen forms part of the museum's vast research collection. It's part of a huge time series of specimens and collections data, which is available to the world's scientists to inform their research into climate change. The specimens within our collections give us greater understanding of not only the world's oceans, but also about corals and their community structure and how their biodiversity is important to us all.
The blue whale is the largest animal that has ever existed, bigger even than the biggest dinosaur. Like so many species, it has an intriguing evolutionary history. Its ancestors had 4 legs, warm blood, and lived on land. But then, about 45 million years ago, they took to the seas, where they evolved into many different species. In recent times, human beings started to hunt them, and by the 1960s many were in danger of extinction. But then the sea-going nations got together and agreed to ban whale hunting. So the blue whale here is a symbol of hope, reminding us of what we can do when we decide to protect endangered animals. Richard Sabin, the museum's senior curator of vertebrates, tells us why this is one of his favourite and most meaningful specimens.
One of the most remarkable things for me about the blue whale is the way that it feeds, and we've tried to reflect that in the position of the skeleton in Hinsey Hall. So our skeleton is shown in a diving position with its mouth open as though it's lunge feeding. Blue whales feed primarily on krill. These are tiny shrimp-like creatures that are super abundant in the ocean. So you've got one of the largest animals on the planet known to have existed feeding on some of the smallest. With the blue whale being the new central specimen in Hinsey Hall, it gives people an opportunity to appreciate just how large these animals are, and the fact that humans took the blue whale to the edge of extinction by the middle of the 1960s. We'd taken their numbers down to just a few hundred, and fortunately, with international cooperation and a moratorium, a ban on commercial whaling, it gave the blue whale chance to recover its numbers. And over the past few decades, that's exactly what's happened. Their numbers are in the few thousands now, so there's still work to do, but the great thing is it shows that if people put their minds to it, if countries work together, conservation measures can work.
This magnificent piece of rock records the very origin of life on Earth. It formed around 2.6 billion years ago as layers of silt were laid down on the floor of an ancient ocean. The distinctive alternating layers of red and brown in such very ancient rocks as this one gives them the name of banded iron formations. The museum holds more than 400,000 mineral and rock specimens. They are used to study major environmental changes in the development of our planet and to find new sources of crucially important minerals. Professor Richard Harrington, head of Earth Sciences at the museum, explains how banded iron formations give us evidence of a significant event in the Earth's early history.
We believe that the ocean that was full of iron at the time started to be the home for a type of bacteria that were able to use light energy to photosynthesize and produce oxygen. And this oxygen was then able to combine with iron that was dissolved in the ocean to form the iron oxide minerals that can then form these very distinctive layers. So the history that this rock is preserving is telling us that the atmosphere in the Earth was changing dramatically, and it probably coincided with the blossoming of life on the planet. This rock is also important because banded iron formations are the major source of the world's iron. This iron is essential for modern life. The buildings that we live in, the railways that we travel on, the cars we drive, all have major amounts of iron in them. We have to be very careful with how we use these kinds of resources, because by studying these rocks we understand that these take millions of years to form, and so these aren't going to be replenished in our lifetimes.
Seaweeds form vast underwater forests from the tropics to the poles and provide homes for all kinds of marine life. Such forests are as widespread around the coasts of Britain as woodlands are on land. These are just a few specimens from the museum's botanical collections that contain not only plants but algae and fungi. They are the organisms on which all other life depends. Seaweeds not only create habitats for other organisms, they help to protect our coasts from erosion. They also contain substances that are important ingredients of many everyday products, such as toothpaste, bandages, and ice cream. Museum researcher Professor Juliet Brodie describes what it's like to swim amongst these forests of the sea, and explains what we can do to preserve them.
If you go down the shore and you come into the shallow water, you'll find yourself in one of the most impressive ecosystems on the planet. Here, around the world, you can find species which might be between 2 meters to perhaps 50 meters tall. That's the height of the museum. There's this incredible variety of marine life, and you'll see all sorts of colours and shapes and forms. Even Darwin commented upon the kelp forests that he saw off the coast of Chile, and he likened them to the tropical rainforest, but he thought they were probably even more diverse. One of the things that we've noticed through our work is that some of the kelp forests are changing in their distribution, and in some parts of the world they've actually disappeared altogether. We have a project here, the Big Seaweed Search, that anybody can join in, and the idea is that people go out to have a lovely day on the shore and record a number of species. And from the data that we gather from this project, we hope that we'll be able to find out what's happening to these species. And at the same time, we'll have a better chance of trying to conserve these remarkable habitats.
This is one of the oldest objects that you will ever see. It's a meteorite. It was formed around 4.5 billion years ago and is one of the 2,000 individual meteorites of many ages in the museum's collections. Most meteorites originate from asteroids. Others come from other planets, from the moon, or even from comets. Studying meteorites like this one helps the museum's scientists and their colleagues around the world to answer fundamental questions about the origins of our solar system and life within it. Dr. Caroline Smith, head of the museum's Earth Sciences collections and principal curator of meteorites, tells us more about the origins of this rare specimen.
This beautiful slice of meteorite is known as the Imilak meteorite because it was found in Chile near the town of Imilak. It's absolutely beautiful with its gorgeous yellow-green crystals of the mineral olivine embedded in the shiny matrix of iron and nickel metal. Meteorites like this give us a lot of insights into what was happening early in our solar system's history and also the building blocks of our own planets. This meteorite may have formed through impacts or through melting of material that was there right at the beginning of the solar system. We're really fortunate here at the museum that we have got one of the world's most significant collections of meteorites. In fact, it's almost unrivaled in its historical importance, its scientific importance, and also its cultural importance of many of the meteorites within our collection. We look at the geology of Mars using Martian meteorites. How did Mars form and what were the conditions like? Could we actually have life on Mars today or maybe in the past? How was water delivered to the early Earth? Water is such a critical component of our planet. Using meteorites from our collection, we look at all of these things and much, much more.
The number of insects in the world is enormous. There may be as many as 5.5 million different species of insects, and many millions of individuals of any one of those species. So, not surprisingly, insects as a group have a widespread and profound effect on the world around us. These species are grouped in 32 orders, and the tray at the bottom of this display contains a typical example of each of those orders. Dr. Gavin Broad, the museum's principal curator of insects, specialises in studying parasitoid wasps and can tell you more about the museum's enormously rich and varied insect collections.
Thousands of insect species are still described every year, including dozens from the collections here at the museum. As well as collecting new insect species from all over the world, museum scientists are also busy exploring the collections already here, full of undescribed species in drawers and bottles. The 37 million insects in our collections are used actively in research. I study parasitoid wasps, describing new species and exploring their diversity. My colleagues study topics ranging from climate change to the evolution of silk production by silk moths. The example of Hymenoptera in the display is Pepsis hieros, the most massive wasp known. It preys on tarantulas, with its offspring eating the paralysed host spider alive. The key to the success of the Hymenoptera is the ability of parasitoid wasps to feed on living flesh. Huge tarantula hawks catch the eye, but most wasps are tiny, busily laying their eggs in or on the bodies of other insects all around us. Insects are involved in most of the interactions that make up our world. Our food crops, our livestock, our health are all linked to insects. Although we often view them negatively as pests and parasites, they are also hugely beneficial as pest control and pollinators. Our lives are completely entwined with insects.
To discover more about the museum's insect collections and see something of the science that goes on behind the scenes, visit the Cocoon in the Darwin Centre. Many of the museum's most famous and important objects were collected by great explorers on their expeditions into hitherto unknown parts of the world. This display illustrates some of these journeys, from Captain Cook's first great voyage around the Pacific to Captain Scott's expeditions in the Antarctic. Marine biologist at the museum, Dr. Adrian Glover, gives his thoughts on the innovative nature of the oceanic voyages of HMS Challenger and explains how this relates to the museum's own explorations.
I think the Challenger expedition in the late 19th century is the perfect example. An expedition which was interdisciplinary. For the first time, physical, chemical and biological measurements of our oceans were taken on one single voyage, and this expedition launched really the science of oceanography. Here at the Natural History Museum we still do a vast amount of exploration and discovery science. We're now really involved in informing conservation decisions in really remote regions which are very, very poorly explored. And examples of this being the deep ocean, where we're now having to deal with new mineral frontiers being opened up and collecting biodiversity libraries, data that is essential for decisions that we need to make to preserve these environments. But perhaps most importantly, from a scientific perspective, is that collecting and discovery and exploration is still revolutionizing our knowledge of one of the great stories of our planet, which is the evolution of life on Earth.
Select the next track to hear from a museum scientist who's been following in Captain Scott's footsteps, hunting for meteorites in Antarctica. Captain Scott and his men were among the first to travel any distance on the vast and largely untouched continent of Antarctica. On their return from the South Pole, hauling their sledges and deeply depressed at having been preceded there by Amundsen, the Norwegian explorer, they became increasingly exhausted. But they did not discard the geological specimens that they had collected. They died when they were still over 150 miles from their base camp and safety. Some of these actual rocks can be seen on the right-hand side of this cabinet. Professor Sarah Russell, head of Mineral and Planetary Sciences, discusses what we've learnt from some of Scott's findings and reveals her own reason for travelling to Antarctica.
Scott's expedition team were interested in learning about the geology and zoology of Antarctica, which at that time was completely unknown. The expedition team members collected a lot of rocks, many of which we have here at the Natural History Museum. They've told us about how the climate of Antarctica has changed over time, and it's shown us that it hasn't always been the cold, barren place that we see today. Some of the rocks from Scott's expedition are mudstones that dried out in a warm sun. Some other of his rocks contained plant fossils, so these all point to a picture of Antarctica in the past as being a much warmer and wetter place with abundant life throughout it. There's still lots of scientific reasons to go to Antarctica, and one of them is to search for meteorites. Antarctica is the best continent in the world to find meteorite material. And meteorites are really interesting because most of them date from about 4.5 billion years ago. These meteorites can tell us about the conditions that were prevailing at the time of planet formation and how the Earth and its sister planets came together and evolved to what we see today. Meteorites landed on the Antarctic plateau up to about 1 million years ago, and so they also preserve a record of how the climate has changed in Antarctica over that time. And in that sense they're complementary to Scott's materials, which are telling us more about how the climate in Antarctica has changed over millions and millions of years.
The Natural History Museum is founded on the work of thousands of individual collectors, each of whom had a passion for collecting and understanding objects from the natural world. They gathered specimens from every part of the land and sea, often at considerable personal risk. This display illustrates the lives of some of the key characters who have contributed to the museum's great wealth of specimens. As Head of Life Sciences, Dr. Tim Littlewood explains, Many of the collectors shown here started to explore and collect at a very early age.
We can all remember, perhaps, when we were young, faced with something new, we would ask, what is it? Where does it come from? How is it related? Addressing those three questions, one can begin to collect, to compare and contrast. The difference with natural historians is that they never stop asking these questions. And in doing so, they end up collecting throughout their lifespans. When one considers we have perhaps over 80 million specimens in the Natural History Museum, every single specimen will tell a story about not only the specimen, but about the collector. Why he or she collected it, where they went, and the trials and tribulations they went through to be able to get these specimens. Our collections still provide many new opportunities for discovery. New techniques such as imaging techniques, DNA analysis and so forth allow us to revisit our collections in completely new ways. It's quite a challenge to think about what we should collect next. Do we look at different areas of the Earth that haven't been explored before? How do we deal with a dwindling supply of natural history specimens as the world is constantly changing? Understanding our collections in this light provides us some idea as to what we should be collecting for the future to understand our natural world as it is changing from now into the next decades.
Select the next tract to hear more about the life and interests of Sir Hans Sloane, whose extensive personal collection became the basis of the museum. Sir Hans Sloane was one of the greatest collectors of all time. During his life, he amassed more than 400,000 specimens. From insects to elephant bones, from fossils to fishes, as well as books, coins, and all kinds of antiquities. On his death in 1753, they became the founding collection of the British Museum in central London. Over the next 100 years, the museum grew rapidly, and eventually, in 1880, the natural history collections, including Sloane's specimens, were transferred to this new museum in South Kensington that was specially built for them. Sloane's first love was botany, and his serious collecting began when, at the age of 27, he set sail on a voyage to the West Indies. Dr. Victoria Pickering has studied Sloane's surviving botanical collections for many years.
In 1687, Sloane travelled to Jamaica as physician to the Duke of Albemarle, and while he was there, he explored, collected and made observations about the natural world around him. He returned to London in 1689 with over 800 different plant specimens. Almost 20 years later, he published the first volume of his Natural History of Jamaica. You can see the frontispiece of this here in the cabinet. This was a richly illustrated book containing engraved images of botanical specimens, insects, birds, fish, and other artifacts. Also, you can see here in the cabinet an illustration of the cacao tree, which Sloane collected a sample of while in Jamaica. Given his role as a physician, he was particularly interested in how local people used it medicinally. He had a network of correspondence that really spanned the globe, which included women, merchants, and princes. They sent him objects from all over the world, and it was through these different connections and relationships that Sloane was able to create one of the most significant collections of this period.
The Natural History Museum owes its spectacular architecture and indeed its very existence to Sir Richard Owen. He was an outstanding scientist and a very formidable character. While at the British Museum in Bloomsbury, central London, he fought vigorously to establish a new separate museum to house the rapidly increasing natural history collections which were in his charge. He insisted that this new museum should be like a cathedral to nature, to show the wonders of creation. In 1883, after supervising the installation of the collections here, he retired. He was succeeded by William Flower, who, in the new role of director, brought a fresh attitude to the appearance and purpose of the museum. Today's director, Sir Michael Dixon, reflects on the legacy of Flower and of his successors.
While it is largely thanks to Owen that the museum exists, it is thanks to Flower that many museums look the way they do today. He firmly believed that a museum should provide both education and entertainment, with displays that were attractive as well as engaging. Flower's then innovative practices effected a major transformation in museum display. He was also an early convert to Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, and reflected this revolutionary scientific thinking in his exhibits. Like Flower, each director since has come with their own ideas which shape the ethos and practice of the museum. Their guidance ensures that we are constantly evolving in response to scientific advances, changing societal values and environmental challenges.
To hear more about Richard Owen, his life, career and controversial character, select the next track. The founding of the Natural History Museum was the crowning achievement of Sir Richard Owen's career. But Owen was also a great biologist and a politically well-connected figure in Victorian society. Scientists often sought his opinion on novel and curious finds from around the world, and Owen, in consequence, became the first to describe and name many hundreds of new species. His anatomical expertise and intuition was extraordinary. It enabled him, for example, to deduce that a gigantic flightless bird called a moa had once existed in New Zealand, simply from studying a single small fragment of bone. Gowan Dawson, Professor of Victorian Literature and Culture at the University of Leicester, tells us more about Owen's career and sometimes controversial character.
Richard Owen is a much caricatured figure, and this is largely because he was a prominent opponent of Charles Darwin and his theory of natural selection. In many ways, he really backed the wrong horse in the most important race in 19th century science. This has led Owen often to be thought of as being adamantly anti-evolution, but this is quite wrong. He opposed Darwin, but he had his own theory of evolution that involved kind of God ordaining evolutionary changes. Beyond Darwin, Owen was very much the most prominent naturalist in Victorian Britain, famous for many things. Most notably, in 1842, he grouped together a series of Mesozoic land reptiles and called them the Dinosauria, and of course we know them today as the dinosaurs. Although Owen was often hated by his fellow scientists, he was actually a very popular man in wider society, and he was friends with the novelist Charles Dickens, the politician William Gladstone, and the artist William Holman Hunt. In fact, they all supported his idea for a separate natural history museum, and it was with their help that it came to fruition.
The museum's specimens make up one of the world's most intriguing cabinets of curiosities. This mix of pickled, pressed, dried, skinned and mounted specimens demonstrates the different methods used to prepare specimens. In the centre of the case you can see a spectacular array of hummingbirds, with spirit and skeleton preparations below and fully feathered mounted specimens overhead. The museum houses one of the largest collections of bird skins in the world, containing almost 750,000 specimens, about 95% of all known bird species. The collection is used by researchers from across the globe interested in the evolution and conservation of birds. Museum bird curator Hein von Grau talks more about how to preserve collections, from mounted specimens to skins and skeletons, and describes a slightly gruesome but very efficient cleaning method.
Although a mounted specimen looks far nicer, it looks more natural, as if it is alive, as a museum we prefer study skins for scientific research. Why do we prefer study skins? Because a study skin, first of all, is easier to measure. Taking measurements is an important part of scientific research. Wing length, beak length, feet length, the length of the tail, where are certain colors on the bird. So examining a skin is far easier than measuring and examining a mounted specimen. Another part of the museum's bird collection is bird skeletons. The way the museum mainly cleans its skeletons is making use of beetles, so-called flesh-eating beetles. A dead bird get more or less stripped down, taken off all the meat, skin and feathers, and a rough skeleton is put in a box, and the beetle larvae will do the rest. They eat all the meat till the bones are completely clean and are then taken out, degreased, dried and put in the collection for further research.
To hear more about the exceptional life and work of pioneer fossil hunter Dorothea Bate, select the next track. Dorothea Bate was a determined and adventurous woman who rose from the job of museum preparator to become a pioneering fossil hunter. Much of her extensive knowledge was gained by preparing thousands of fossil specimens for the museum. You can see some examples of these in the left-hand side of the cabinet. Carolyn Schindler, Dorothea Bate's biographer, describes her remarkable life and some of her discoveries.
Dorothea Bate was one of the first women ever to work as a scientist in this museum. She first talked her way in here in 1898, when she was just 19, and she was exceptional. It became part of the Dorothea Bate legend that if sufficient quantities of bony fragments were sent to her, she would not only identify the fauna, but could also suggest the climate and environment as well. In the early 1900s, Dorothea's fearless and often dangerous explorations of Cyprus, Crete and the Balearics revealed for the first time dwarf elephants and hippos barely a metre high. And of course on the Balearics, she discovered the unique goatee antelope displayed here, Myotragus, which means mouse goat. During her lifetime, Dorothea was internationally renowned. I like to think of her at the heart of a great web of scientists from all parts of the world who sent their material to her for her expertise. In 1924, although she was never a full member of staff, she was appointed curator of Pleistocene mammals and fossil birds. In 1948, when she was nearly 70, she was appointed to her first managerial post as officer in charge of the NHM Sister Museum at Tring. After her death in 1951, she was quickly forgotten, until recently. Dorothea's extraordinary achievements are all the more remarkable as she was almost entirely self-educated. And it's through her writings and collections that scientists today, working in her field, are making so many exciting new discoveries.
This cabinet celebrates 4 remarkable individuals who've pushed the boundaries of scientific inquiry and transformed the way we think about the natural world and humanity's place within it. Edward Tyson, Carl Linnaeus, Thomas Henry Huxley and Charles Darwin. Scientists behind the scenes here at the museum continued those inquiries using the latest technology to study the collections. Yet much of their work is still inspired by theories developed by these great scientists. As you will see here, there are still many questions to answer. Director of Science, Professor Ian Owens, reflects on the impact of these pioneering thinkers.
The people in this cabinet have asked some of the most profound questions that humans have ever asked. How was the natural world created? Where did all the species come from? And ultimately, where did we come from? They brought a new scientific rigour to answering these sorts of questions, which allowed us to test which ideas were more likely to be correct. If we were to think about the sort of discovery that might have a similar impact today, it would be to find that life on this Earth actually came from other planets. Imagine the impact that that would have, not just of our understanding of the universe, but also of this planet and ourselves. If I were to pick one object from this cabinet, it would be the Archaeopteryx illustration under the Thomas Huxley section. One of the big criticisms of evolutionary theory is the lack of missing links between groups like birds and their evolutionary ancestors. The breakthrough that Huxley made was to demonstrate that this new fossil finding, Archaeopteryx, was actually a little feathered dinosaur, and that it was very closely related to birds. That was a mind-blowing idea for those times, to link everyday groups like birds with new discoveries like dinosaurs. I think it's a great illustration of how big ideas work.
Select the next track to hear how the ideas and writings of these great thinkers are still inspiring exciting new discoveries today. The work of these great thinkers not only revolutionized scientific thinking, but also raised many new questions. As a result, their specimens and writings are still, hundreds of years later, sparking new scientific discoveries. During the voyage of HMS Beagle in the 1830s, Charles Darwin discovered fossils of several large South American mammals. He referred to them as the strangest animals ever discovered, because they had a puzzling combination of features typical of several very different creatures: rodents, hippos and whales. Their unusual shapes left scientists baffled as to where these animals fit on the mammalian family tree. Now, more than 180 years later, a study involving museum scientists has revealed their evolutionary origins. Museum research leader Professor Ian Barnes tells us more about his research on these bizarre beasts.
While he was in Uruguay, Darwin found an odd-looking skull of an extinct animal that ended up being named Toxodon platensis. Since then, scientists have realised that Toxodon was just one of hundreds of related species of animals that lived in South America over the last 60 million years. These animals are important in the development of Darwin's theory of evolution because they're one of the things that got him thinking that there might be extinct species that were ancestral to species alive today. However, Toxodon and its relatives are so utterly unlike anything alive today that it's been impossible to deduce what they evolved from by simply looking at their bones. Recently, I was part of a team of scientists that managed to resolve this problem. We started out by trying to recover DNA from these fossils, but we found that the DNA was too old and broken down to use. So instead, we had to develop a new method using a bone protein called collagen that survives much better than DNA. With the new technique, we found that Toxodon and its relatives are distantly related to horses, tapirs and rhinos, and we're now using that information to finally understand how these animals evolved.
The Natural History Museum stands as a cathedral to nature, a monument to the passion and ideas of its founder, Sir Richard Owen. As you look around, you will see that the building is enlivened by sculptures of all kinds of animal, some living, some prehistoric, from imposing feline gargoyles on the roof to mischievous monkeys clambering up the pillars. These captivating images were designed in collaboration between Owen and the building's architect, Alfred Waterhouse. John Holmes, Professor of Victorian Literature and Culture at the University of Birmingham, describes how these impressive and intricate designs were produced.
Owen and Waterhouse worked closely together. Owen would provide diagrams, specimens, and Waterhouse would design the terracotta menagerie that covers the museum on the basis of those drawings. The result is both scientifically precise and imaginatively rich and beautiful. The original building for the Natural History Museum comprises 3 parts. There's the central hall, which was the nave of Owen's great cathedral. And in the several side chapels there was an index to the natural world. Then there were the 2 wings. If you look at the front of the building, you'll see that the wing in the east is decorated with extinct animals and plants, and the wing in the west with living animals and plants. This suggests a vision of nature that is not Darwinian, because the living things and the extinct things do not blend into one another. There's no evolutionary continuum. Instead, there is a fixity. So the building as a whole encapsulates Owen's science, a science that was already close to obsolete in its own time. It's like a fossil of a scientific worldview. But at the same time, it encapsulates the pleasure that Waterhouse in particular took in his own architecture. And that's a pleasure that we can share today.
If you continue up to the 2nd floor, you can see a display of plans and sketches produced by Owen and Waterhouse, as well as some of the animals that inspired them. Above your head, in the vast arched ceiling of Hinsey Hall, is an often overlooked treasure of the museum. These elegant paintings in red, gold and green depict a wide variety of plants from across the globe. At the time the museum was built, the Victorian Society was interested in the union of industry and nature for the furtherance of society. This marriage is captured in the combination of detailed botanical paintings and impressively strong cast iron girders. Museum botanist Dr. Sandy Knapp reveals some of the secrets of this enchanting gilded canopy.
The ceiling of Hinsey Hall, if you look up, is the one place where plants are really shown in all their pride and power. And one of the interesting things about the ceiling is that it's really a reflection of Victorian society itself. In the central hall, where the ceiling is very high, the plants are all trees and depicted in panels of 6, so it looks as though the tree itself is growing through the panels towards the top. This was intended to give the impression of growth and grandeur. Go up on the landing by the sequoia, and each plant has its own panel. This eclectic collection contains many of the plants that fueled the British Empire, things like cotton, tobacco, tea, and coffee. Some of the plants on the ceiling are familiar to us today, things like lilies or foxgloves or pineapples. But to a Victorian person coming to the museum for the first time, lilies might be familiar, foxgloves certainly, but a pineapple? Pineapples are something that definitely most people wouldn't have seen or been able to go down to the corner shop and buy like we can now. So one of the other things that the ceiling shows us is that many of the things familiar to us today were perhaps not so familiar to people over 100 years ago. How times change.
If you wish to take a closer look at some of these artworks, visit the displays on the 2nd floor.
ットゥルー。 トゥットゥルー Mm-hmm.